My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 65 years old, and I have already buried the love of my life. Standing at my husband's grave, I thought grief would be my only burden, but I was wrong. Yesterday, my own son looked me in the eye, his voice steady, his heart cold, and said, "It's what Dad would have wanted." He demanded I give him every dollar, every piece of inheritance Richard left behind. What happened next turned my mourning into fire, and I swear I will never forgive him for what he tried to steal. Before I begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know which place in the world holds your eyes tonight as you listen to my truth. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 65 years old, and I have already buried the love of my life. Richard was my anchor, my shield, the man who worked every extra shift, just so I could retire without worry. When I stood by his grave for the first time, I believed the worst pain was behind me. I was wrong. The cemetery was quiet, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth and roses. Someone had left hours earlier. I ran my fingers across Richard's name, carved into the granite, the letters cold and merciless under my touch. It was supposed to be a sacred space, a place of memory and reflection. Yet on that day, it became something else entirely, a stage for betrayal. Because there, at the very edge of my grief, my own son came to me with words that would twist my sorrow into rage. Michael approached with the kind of calm arrogance I had seen in him before, but never at such a moment. He placed his hand on the headstone as if staking a claim, his eyes refusing to meet mine. I thought perhaps he had come to mourn his father, or even to offer me comfort. Instead, his lips curled into a practiced smile, and he spoke with the certainty of someone who believed he could not be denied. He told me it was time I handed over everything Richard left behind. At first, I thought I had misheard him, that grief had distorted his words into something darker than intended. But then he leaned closer, his tone sharpened, and he repeated himself without hesitation. "It's what Dad would have wanted," he said. Those 6 words cut through me like a blade, sharper than any cruelty a stranger could have delivered. My own son invoked the man I loved to demand what he had no right to claim. I felt the ground beneath me shift, as though the world itself had turned against me. The inheritance was not wealth by the standards of the powerful, but to me it was everything. $50,000 saved through years of sacrifice, and the small house Richard and I built together, brick by brick. It was security, dignity, the promise that I could live the rest of my days without fear of hunger or abandonment. Michael knew this, and still he dared to reduce it to spoils, as if my life, my sacrifice, could be bartered away with a sentence. His eyes gleamed with expectation, waiting for my surrender. I did not answer him immediately. Instead, I looked past him, at the fading lights spilling across the cemetery, turning the stones gold for a brief moment before the sun sank completely. My silence was not agreement, but resistance forming like steel inside me. That was the instant I understood. Michael had underestimated me. He believed my grief made me weak. He believed my love made me blind. But what he would learn sooner than he expected is that a mother can grieve and still sharpen her heart into a weapon. Michael did not stop with that single sentence. He leaned against the headstone as though it belonged to him, his voice lowering so only I could hear. He said it was time for me to stop clinging to the past, that Richard's money and the house were wasted in my hands. I felt the tremor in my chest grow stronger, not from fear, but from the realization that my son had rehearsed every word. He had come to the grave not to mourn, but to take. His tone sharpened when I did not answer. He reminded me of the years he had spent trying to build a life, how debts had swallowed him, how opportunities slipped away. Then he spoke of the house, insisting that Richard never intended it to rot under my care. He painted pictures of selling it, of turning the money into something greater, but his words rang hollow. He spoke not as a son burdened by loss, but as a man poisoned by greed. I looked into his eyes, searching for even the faintest glimmer of the boy I once knew, the child who had clung to my hand at his father's funeral. But what I found was a man hardened by disappointment, cloaked in entitlement. He said again that it was what Dad would have wanted. This time, there was no softness, no disguise of respect, only command. He wanted obedience, and he thought the grave itself gave him the authority to demand it. Inside me, memories began to surface like ghosts refusing to rest. The nights Richard and I spent worrying over bills, the sacrifices we made so Michael could attend college, the second jobs we both took to cover his mistakes. Every choice had been for him. Every burden carried in the hope that he might stand tall one day. And yet here he was, twisting the sacrifices into chains, trying to bind me at the very place where his father's bones lay silent. I spoke his name, steady but firm, and he flinched at the sound. I told him he would not shame his father's memory this way, not while I still had breath. His jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist, but I did not waver. He may have believed the weight of grief made me weak, but he underestimated the fury that grief could forge. I stood before him not only as his mother, but as Richard's widow, carrying both love and rage like weapons. The wind rose through the cemetery, scattering leaves across the stone paths. And for a moment we stood in silence, mother and son divided by the grave of a man who had loved us both. Michael thought he could break me with demands, but he had only sharpened my resolve. What came next would not be surrender. It would be reckoning. And if you are listening now, stay with me until the end. Because what unfolded afterward will make you question the very meaning of family. As Michael's words echoed in the cold air, I felt memories pulling me backward, dragging me through years of sacrifice that seemed almost forgotten. I remembered working double shifts at the school library, staying late under the harsh lights, just to earn enough to cover his tuition. Richard picked up extra hours at the factory, his hands cracked and blistered from the machines. Also, our son could study without worry. Every dollar we earned was funneled into his future, a future we believed would reward our devotion. I remembered the first time he failed. His grades dropped, excuses piled higher than the bills, and yet we carried him through. Richard sold his fishing boat, the one thing that gave him peace, and I pawned the wedding necklace my mother had left me. Michael never asked us to, but he never refused the help either. He took it all, the sacrifices, the silent tears, as though it was his birthright. And now, at his father's grave, he dared to claim it always had been. Even when adulthood came, he stumbled again and again. The job he lost for reckless spending, the car he ruined after a night of drinking, the debts we paid off because the collectors called my phone and threatened to take everything. Each time, Richard told me that one day Michael would understand. One day he would be grateful, but gratitude never came. Instead, entitlement grew like a shadow over his character, swallowing whatever light of innocence he once had. I looked at him now and saw not the boy who once cried at scraped knees, but the man who believed our sacrifices were owed to him forever. His eyes no longer held shame. They carried expectation, a demand written into his very bones. He spoke again, quieter this time, reminding me that Dad had always believed in him. His words dripped with manipulation, each syllable designed to pierce through my defenses. But they no longer worked, not here, not now. The truth burned in me like a torch. Richard had believed in him, yes, but Richard also believed in me, in the life we built, in the dignity of work, and the value of respect. Michael twisted his father's faith into justification for greed, but I knew better. I had lived beside the man who now rested beneath this earth, and I knew what he wanted. Not for me to surrender everything, but for me to survive, to stand strong even when grief clawed at my chest. I straightened my shoulders, my hand still pressed to the stone, and I realized something Michael never would. Love without boundaries turns into chains. Our sacrifices had not lifted him. They had shackled me. That day, standing between the living and the dead, I swore to myself that his demands would be the last chain he ever tried to fasten on me. Before this ended, he would learn what it meant to face a mother's fury, sharpened by loss. And if you believe in justice, don't just listen, subscribe, because this story is only beginning to burn. Michael's voice grew heavier, the words striking me like stones against glass, already cracked by grief. He said it was pointless for me to cling to a life alone, that I was wasting away while money and property sat idle. He painted a picture where I was nothing more than a fragile widow who should hand over her burdens to a stronger man. He did not realize that every insult disguised as concern only carved deeper lines of betrayal into my heart. He stepped closer, lowering his tone until it became a whisper meant to corner me. He said I could trust him, that he would take care of everything, that I should rest and let him handle what Richard left behind. The audacity of his promise made my skin crawl. I had seen him destroy every chance given to him, squander every sacrifice, and yet he dared to speak as though he carried the wisdom of a patriarch. His confidence was not love, it was theft rehearsed as devotion. I remembered the night Richard once warned me that grief reveals the truth in people, stripping away every mask. And standing before me, my son wore no disguise. He was not mourning, he was hunting. He told me again that it was what Dad wanted, his words sharper this time, his eyes cold as stone. He wanted obedience without question, a signature without thought, and he thought invoking his father's name would shackle me into submission. He could not have been more wrong. My reply came measured, though the rage inside me burned hot. I told him Richard never wanted greed to govern our lives, never wanted lies to poison our family. My voice carried across the cemetery, steady enough that even the crows in the trees grew quiet. Michael's jaw clenched, his fists trembling at his sides, but still he did not retreat. He had come with a plan, and he believed he could outlast my resistance. He would learn that endurance belongs to the mother, not the son. The silence between us thickened until it felt like a storm pressing against the ground. I saw the veins in his temple, the strain in his posture, the way frustration boiled beneath his skin. He tried once more, softer this time, telling me that I was making things harder for myself, that I was alone and needed him. Those words cut sharper than any demand. He did not want to protect me. He wanted to consume what remained of my life and call it mercy. I stood taller. My hand pressed firm against the headstone, and I felt Richard's presence steady me. Michael believed he had cornered me, but I had endured storms greater than his ambition. Grief may hollow a woman, but it can also forge her into steel. And as I looked into my son's eyes, I knew the next step would not be silence. It would be retaliation. Before I speak of what I planned, let me ask you. Leave a comment now. Tell me if you have ever faced betrayal within your own family, and how you survived it. Michael's eyes narrowed when I refused to answer quickly, and his voice turned sharp enough to slice through the cold air. He told me I was clinging to the past, that I was letting grief rot me from the inside out. He said Richard would have been disappointed to see me hoarding money and property instead of passing it on to the next generation. Every word was a twist of the knife, dressed as reason but delivered as accusation. He shifted closer, lowering his voice so no one else in the cemetery could hear. He said I should hand everything over to him because he would know how to manage it better than I ever could. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the arrogance of a man who believed his failures were invisible. I stared at him, remembering every debt I had paid, every mistake I had cleaned up, and I knew his promise was a lie woven from desperation. When silence stretched between us, Michael filled it with cruelty. He told me I was weak, that I was old, that my days of independence were numbered. He said, if I truly loved my family, I would give him control. Let him rebuild his life with what Richard left behind. His voice shook with something darker than need. It trembled with entitlement. It was not love he spoke of, nor duty, it was hunger, raw and shameless. I felt my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with fury. I told him Richard never raised us to worship money, never raised us to twist grief into leverage. My words did not tremble. Though my hands pressed harder against the stone, Michael's jaw tightened, his expression hardened, but he did not retreat. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath hot with bitterness, and said again that I had no choice. He believed he had me cornered. The leaves rustled as the wind moved through the cemetery, and I realized the stillness of that place was no shield against his ambition. He stood there, a man I once called my son, now nothing more than a predator circling prey. Yet I was not prey, and grief had not hollowed me into weakness. It had sharpened me. He thought his demands would silence me, but every word only fueled the fire I had been holding back. Since the day Richard was lowered into the earth, I turned my gaze from the ground to his face, letting him see the steel he thought no longer existed in me. He believed grief made me fragile, but grief had forged something else entirely. I told him in a voice steady and cold that this battle was not his to win. What he thought was obedience would become defiance, and what he thought was inheritance would become his downfall. Before I share how I turned his demands into my weapon, let me ask you to leave a comment. Would you have endured or resisted if faced with betrayal from your own child? The more Michael insisted, the more my mind drifted back to Richard, to the voice that steadied me through every storm. I remembered the night he told me that love was not about giving endlessly, but about protecting what was sacred. His words came back to me with striking clarity. Never allow grief to turn you into someone's prey. Standing at his grave, I felt those words rise from memory into armor, shielding me against the son who dared to twist his legacy. I thought of Richard's hands, calloused and scarred, the evidence of years spent building a life that was modest but honest. He never asked for luxury. He asked for dignity, for respect, for a family bound by loyalty rather than greed. If he could see Michael now, I knew disappointment would cloud his eyes, heavier than death itself. Michael believed he could speak for his father, but Richard's silence beneath the earth carried more truth than his son's poisoned tongue. Michael spoke again, softer this time, his eyes searching my face for weakness. He said I should not make things harder, that Dad had trusted him, that the right choice was to pass everything down. His voice trembled, but it was not grief, it was frustration at my defiance. I heard his plea, but beneath it I heard something louder, the echo of every failure he refused to own. He wanted inheritance to wash away his ruin, and I would not let him. I placed my hand on the stone, whispering to Richard as though he could hear me. I told him I would not betray the life we built, that I would not let our work dissolve into Michael's hunger. My words steadied me, each syllable wrapping around my spine until I felt taller, stronger. I could almost feel Richard beside me, his presence like a weight on my shoulder, reminding me that survival was an act of love, and resistance was a duty. Michael sneered, mistaking my silence for hesitation. He told me time was running out, that the money meant nothing, sitting idle in accounts, that the house was only bricks rotting without purpose. I let him speak, let his arrogance fill the space, because I no longer feared his demands. In my chest, anger turned into resolve, and I realized this was not only about inheritance, it was about dignity, about refusing to let my son strip me of the last piece of myself Richard had left intact. I turned to him with a calmness he could not comprehend, and I said his father's memory was not his weapon. My voice carried the weight of every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment of grief I had endured. Michael's smirk faltered, his certainty cracked, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Before I reveal how that moment set the stage for what came next, I want you to take a stand if you believe dignity is worth defending. Subscribe now, because this story is only beginning to unveil its reckoning. Michael's persistence no longer surprised me. He circled me like a vulture, every word dripping with entitlement, convinced he could wear me down. But inside, something had shifted. Grief had hardened into iron, and my silence became strategy rather than surrender. I realized that the best retaliation was not fury shouted in the open, but decisions made quietly, steps planned with precision. If he wanted war, I would fight it not with emotion, but with cunning Richard would have admired. He spoke again, calling me stubborn, telling me I was blind to the future. He said the inheritance would give him a chance to prove himself, that I had already lived my life and it was time for him to live his. His tone held a mocking patience, as if he were a father lecturing a child. Yet his eyes betrayed the truth: desperation, fear of the debts chasing him, fear that I might finally deny him what he thought was his by right. I answered calmly, telling him life had already given him chances, more than most men would ever see. I reminded him of the sacrifices Richard and I had made, the debts we had cleared, the opportunities he had squandered. My words were not loud, but they struck him harder than any scream. His smirk faded, his jaw tightened, and for the first time he looked less like a man demanding obedience, and more like a child realizing his game was slipping out of control. In that silence, my mind moved quickly. I thought of the accounts, the property, the small savings Richard and I had hidden away. Michael believed he could bully me into signing everything, but he did not know the safeguards Richard and I had placed long before illness took him. I knew every detail, every lock on the accounts, every clause in the will. If Michael wanted a battle, he would find himself fighting shadows he could not touch. I told him Richard's memory was not his weapon, and that my grief was not his path to fortune. He called me bitter, said I was twisting love into punishment. His voice cracked with the frustration of a man who felt control slipping away. But beneath his words I saw something that almost made me smile. Fear. Fear of what would happen when I no longer bent to his demands. Fear of discovering that his power over me was nothing more than illusion. As I stood there, hand against the stone, I swore to myself that this was the moment the game changed. Michael thought he had cornered me, but he had only pushed me toward resolve. I would protect what Richard left me, not out of greed, but out of loyalty to the man who earned it, with his blood and sweat. And before this story ends, you will see exactly how a mother's silence turns into justice. If you believe, betrayal should never go unanswered. Hit the like button now and let the world know you stand against it. Michael's arrogance faltered as I stood taller, refusing to bend beneath the weight of his demands. I let silence stretch between us, not as weakness, but as a weapon. Finally, I broke it with words sharp as glass. I told him Richard never left his legacy for destruction, that his father's name would not be used to cover the ashes of Michael's failures. My voice was steady, almost calm, but inside I carried the fury of every sacrifice twisted into manipulation. His lips curled into a sneer, and he told me I was overestimating myself, that I had no power to stop him. He said signatures could be forced, documents could be arranged, and resistance would only prolong the inevitable. Hearing my own son threaten me beside his father's grave was a cruelty I could not ignore. Yet instead of fear, I felt something stronger rise, a sense of clarity that this was no longer about inheritance, but about stripping away his illusions. I reminded him of the collectors who had called me, the letters I had opened when his debt swallowed him whole. I told him I knew every weakness he carried, every secret he tried to bury. His eyes shifted for the first time, betraying a flash of unease, though his words tried to recover. He told me I was cruel, that I had never trusted him, that his father would have chosen him over me. Those words landed like poison, but I refused to let them wound me. Instead, I struck back with truth. I told him Richard trusted me because I had earned it, because loyalty is proven not through promises but through action. I said his father worked himself to the bone to give us stability, and I would not let Michael gamble it away with another scheme doomed to collapse. The air between us grew colder, heavy with tension, and I saw his composure crack under the weight of my defiance. He called me stubborn, desperate to regain the upper hand, but I saw the edges of panic fraying his bravado. I told him stubbornness was survival, and survival was the only reason he still stood before me. Every dollar, every roof over his head, had been bought by my unwillingness to let him drown. Now, that same strength would become the wall that barred him from tearing apart Richard's legacy. He could sneer all he wished, but he would never pass that wall again. The cemetery seemed to listen, the wind hissing through the branches as though echoing my words. Michael stood rigid, his fists clenched, but I knew he had heard me. His confidence had cracked, and no matter how he tried to patch it with bravado, the truth lingered. He could no longer pretend his power was unshakable. As I turned my gaze back to the headstone, I made a silent vow that before this ended he would learn what it meant to betray a mother. And if you have ever stood unbroken against someone who thought they could control you, share this story now so others know they are not alone. Michael shifted his weight, his arrogance fraying with every second he realized I would not yield. I watched him carefully, and for the first time, I let a small, knowing smile cross my lips. I told him he believed I was defenseless, but he knew nothing of the measures Richard and I had taken before his illness claimed him. My words cut into him with quiet precision, reminding him that the inheritance was not a loose treasure he could simply seize with demands. He frowned, his voice rising with unease as he asked what I meant. I answered slowly, making sure each word carried weight. I told him the accounts were locked with provisions that required my consent alone, and that the house, the very bricks he wanted to sell, had my name etched on every document. Richard had prepared with me, not with him, and the security of those decisions could not be undone by tantrums or threats whispered in a graveyard. His face paled, though he tried to mask it with anger. He spat accusations, saying I had poisoned his father against him, that I had twisted Richard's love into fear. His voice cracked, the mask slipping, revealing the desperation he fought so hard to hide. I stood firm, telling him Richard had always hoped Michael would rise, but he prepared for the opposite because he had seen the truth in his son's actions. Richard's love had not blinded him. It had forced him to protect me, even beyond death. Michael recoiled as if the words themselves struck him. The fury in his eyes deepened, and he stepped closer as though intimidation might erase the reality of what I revealed. He said money and houses meant nothing if I was too frail to hold them, that eventually I would depend on him whether I wanted to or not. I let him finish, then told him plainly that dependence was his curse, not mine. I had lived my life by enduring, by resisting, by outlasting storms that would have broken him. I told him I would outlast him too. His silence that followed was thick, broken only by the rustle of leaves around us. I could see the cracks widening in his armor, the confidence draining as the truth pressed harder than any refusal I had given. He thought inheritance was his salvation, but now he realized it was locked away by a will stronger than his own. Richard's foresight had built the fortress, and my defiance now guarded its gates. Michael had stumbled into a war he could never win. I let my words settle before turning back to the headstone, laying my palm against the granite, as though sealing my vow. I promised Richard silently that I would defend what he built, not only for myself, but for the truth of the life we shared. Michael's shadow lingered near me, but I no longer saw a threat. I saw a man stripped of illusions, cornered by the reality he could not bend. If you stand for protecting what is sacred against those who seek to steal it, leave a like now, so this message travels further than betrayal ever could. Michael's bravado collapsed into silence, his fists trembling at his sides, his breath uneven as though the weight of truth pressed against his chest. I watched him with cold clarity, realizing he was no longer the son I once raised, but a stranger carved by greed. I told him directly that the inheritance he craved would never be his, that Richard's foresight and my will had already sealed his fate. He blinked hard, anger flickering, but behind it I saw fear, undeniable fear. He lashed out with words meant to wound, accusing me of betrayal, calling me a mother who chose money over her own child. But the venom in his voice no longer stung. I answered calmly, telling him I had chosen dignity, not money, survival, not surrender. I reminded him that Richard's name was not his to use as leverage, that the grave he leaned upon would judge him harsher than I ever could. His expression faltered as if the weight of those words finally struck bone. I stepped closer, so near he could not escape my gaze. I told him I knew of the debts, of the collectors circling his life like wolves. I said they would come for him, but they would never touch me, never touch what Richard had built. I spoke of strength, of endurance, of a legacy he would never possess, because he had never earned it. My voice was not loud, but it was final, and he knew it. His silence became confession. He muttered weakly that he only wanted a chance, that he only wanted to prove himself. But those pleas came too late, drowned by years of squandered opportunities, and the echo of every sacrifice already wasted on him. I told him the truth. His father had prepared, not because he hated him, but because he had known this day would come. Richard had trusted me to protect his memory, and I would honor that trust until my last breath. Michael lowered his eyes, retreating step by step, his shoulders sagging as though the fight had been ripped from his body. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man stripped of illusions. I stood firm, refusing to soften, because mercy had long ago turned into chains that nearly bound me. As he walked away, I felt the weight of Richard's presence steady me. This was not victory born of cruelty, but justice carved from necessity. I pressed my palm against the cold granite of Richard's grave, whispering that I had kept my promise. The wind carried my words into the silence, and for the first time since his death, I felt peace rather than emptiness. Betrayal had tried to steal from me, but vengeance had preserved what mattered most: dignity, loyalty, and strength. If you believe no one should surrender to betrayal, share this story now, because silence allows greed to thrive. But truth spoken aloud becomes the weapon that ends it.